signing up for notification emails, or filling out the initial project survey are the best ways to stay informed for the time being. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available online once it is uploaded. As a note, if you heard about this workshop from our email list, that's great. If not, please feel welcome to sign up for the county's email registry, and you'll be provided future notifications on this project. A link is being provided in chat. So, this project is headed up by the county's Long Range Planning and Development Department and is being assisted by Wood Environment and Infrastructure Solutions here in Santa Barbara. With us today from the county, we have Julie Harris and David Lackey. Julie, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Julie Harris, and I am a senior planner with the Long Range Planning Division at the county. And I'm the project manager for this project tonight. And also with us is David Lackey. He is a supervising planner, and he'll also be working on the project and be available for any Q&A when we get to that part of the workshop. Thank you, Matt.
Sure, thank you, Julie. With Wood, my name is Matthew Buggart. I am the deputy project manager for this effort. With us today, we also have Nick as our technical lead and Gina as one of our stellar supporting planners. Today, we highly encourage audience participation throughout. You can stay engaged via chat, or near the latter half of this workshop, we'll open it up a little bit more for Q&A and microphone involvement. We'll start off with an introduction and overview of the project. I go just a little bit into the regulatory framework, how it would fit in with the county structure. We have had a survey put out to the public, and we'll take a look at some of the initial feedback and preliminary responses. And we'll close out with some discussion questions. For participating, you can use the raise hand button on the Teams app. And Gina will help with unmuting or otherwise opening it up for discussion. You can also provide a comment in the chat feature on Teams. You can submit questions. You can use the raise hand feature. Notes will be taken using a whiteboard, and they will serve as a summary of comments. And of course, feel free to follow up with an email or engage in the survey, of which the links will also be provided and disseminated to the crew. In the chat feature, you can also include your, it would be helpful if you included your name and what your affiliation is. It'd be good to know who we have with us today. If you want to provide contact information, again, you can sign up for the county's sign up and email list. And thank you for your time. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Julie to talk about the goals of the project.
Thank you, Matt. So this project proposes an ordinance amendment that would allow additional supplementary uses on lands that are zoned for agriculture, and specifically the Ag 2 zone. It would provide opportunities for farmers and ranchers to supplement farm income, but it's not intended to overshadow agricultural production. Agriculture must remain the primary use of the land in the Ag 2 zone. Next slide. So before I dive into the details about the Ag Enterprise Ordinance, I would like to take a moment to let you know about a couple of other ongoing projects that affect agricultural lands. So first is an ordinance amendment that would allow farm stays on all of the land zoned Ag 2 countywide. This is a use that is already allowed in Gaviota. And for those of you who are really interested in the farm stays, a second workshop will be held next Monday on March 29th at 5:30 p.m. And the Farm Stays website has more details about that meeting. Second is the countywide recreation master plan. We encourage you to take the ongoing recreation needs survey, and there's a QR code on this slide that actually would take you right there. And also visit the website for that project for more information on upcoming outreach events. So it's a project that would that could have some uses on agricultural lands, and so I think that would be of interest to a lot of folks. But these two projects are separate from the Agricultural Enterprise Ordinance, but we do encourage you to follow their progress. Next slide. So the county consideration of adding supplemental and incidental uses to ag lands began in earnest during the development of the Gaviota Coast Plan, and that resulted in the 2016 adoption of small-scale supplemental and incidental uses for lands that are zoned Ag 2 within the Gaviota Plan area. The Board of Supervisors, that's the BOS on our slide, the Board of Supervisors then added the project to Long Range Planning's work program and launched the amendments in November of 2020. When directing Long Range Planning to proceed with this project, the board focused the scope of amendments on small additional uses that are intended to be small in scale, an ordinance that could be adopted soon so that farmers and ranchers all around the county can soon take advantage of these uses. The board also recognized that there is community interest in larger, more intensive agritourism types of uses, but some of those uses may be identified in the Recreation Master Plan, and ordinance amendments would be pursued in the future as a separate planning effort. Next slide. So this project would expand the range of allowed uses in rural agricultural areas, specifically those lands zoned Ag 2. And it would allow for ag-related uses that are incidental to the primary agricultural use, that's ranching, crop cultivation, orchards, things like that. It would allow uses that are small in scale and that landowners can try out to see if they're a good fit with their ag operations with a relatively low cost investment for the permits. Next slide. So this project envisions two basic categories of use. First are uses that are supplementary agricultural uses and that have some direct support to the existing agricultural use of the land. The second type of use would be low intensity rural recreational uses and rural land experiences. Next slide. Listed here are all of the uses proposed by this project. All of the supplementary uses and 3 of the rural recreation uses have been allowed in the Gaviota area since 2016. And this project would allow those same uses throughout the county on Ag 2. With the exception of lumber processing and small-scale campground, all of the uses that are already allowed in Gaviota have a small-scale option that is exempt from permits within the inland area. Uses must also comply with size and development standards to be allowed with a low-level land use permit. In addition to the Gaviota uses, the board directed us to add 5 uses, and these include incidental food service, small-scale farm-to-table dinners, cooking classes, educational opportunities, and other small-scale events. Most need to be defined, and the levels or intensity of use and the permit thresholds and development standards must also be determined in order to develop the ordinance for these new uses. With respect to agricultural processing beyond the raw state, historically it has been limited to processing wine grapes and more recently pressing olives to produce olive oil. The Gaviota Coast Plan and now this proposal would allow additional small-scale processing beyond the raw state if the majority of the product is grown on the premises. Next slide. In addition, at the November hearing, the board asked Long Range Planning whether a new farm brewery use could be easily added to the project by incorporating it into the winery regulations. In order to determine whether it could be easily added, staff needs some additional information to define farm brewery, to identify appropriate brewery production volumes, to determine whether the winery permit tiers would be appropriate, and to establish a production volume threshold for each farm brewery permit tier. Also needed would be information to determine the acreage of crops used for beer making that would need to be planted on the premises, and whether these crop types can be successfully grown in Santa Barbara County in the quantities that would support a new farm brewery use. We encourage anyone who might have useful information about these issues to please share with us. The information gathered will help us to determine whether to include farm breweries in this project, but if we can't resolve the question soon, we'll have to defer it to a later date. Next slide. So coming into this project, what we've heard is that people are interested in allowing low-intensity uses with a low cost and an efficient permit process. We've also heard that people would like to see uses that could be exempt from permits. So typically, development standards will be required to allow exemptions or low-level permits. An important consideration, especially for the rural recreation uses, involves bringing the public to the property. It raises questions of providing services such as water and wastewater disposal, which might require review and potentially permits from county environmental health. Also, any food service on the property would raise questions regarding whether public health department permits or requirements are needed for the kitchen that prepares the food. And finally, an additional consideration is what to do if a landowner wants to do several of these uses. Should there be additional permitting considerations? And if so, what would trigger the need and what should those permits be? Next slide. So of the 750,000 acres of land zoned Ag 2 in our county, and that doesn't include the state and federal lands, 64% of it is within agricultural preserve contracts. So we know that there are likely to be agricultural enterprise uses proposed on lands that are within these agricultural preserves. And any individual permit or entitlement would need review by the Agricultural Preserve Advisory Committee, or APAC. In addition, APAC will review this proposed Ag Enterprise Ordinance to determine whether there is a need to amend the uniform rules to specifically allow some of these new uses. And next slide. And then finally, here is a map that illustrates all of the Ag 2 zone in the county, excluding those state and federal lands like the Los Padres National Forest or Vandenberg Air Force Base. The darker green color actually depicts the Ag 2 zone lands that are currently under the Ag Preserve contract. So you can see in this illustration, it is quite a bit. So at this time, I'd like to hand the presentation back to Wood to discuss the preliminary survey results. Matt?
Thank you, Julie. And apologies for advancing there. There were some timers set on the PowerPoint slides unknowingly. About 2 weeks ago or so, a survey was put out to the public to receive responses. It included a few questions, and as of today, we have approximately 102 responses. The graphs on the following pages represent 95 of those comments as of a few days ago. The first question asked about who was interested in the project. Just about everybody that was taking the survey was taking it to stay informed. There were also a number of people that followed it up that were concerned about diversifying uses and those that own and operate land in the county already. There were much less responders that owned land and leased land, or those that just leased land. Farm stands, ag product preparation and processing, and composting were really popular. Lumber and firewood processing and aquaponics were not as popular. however, could still be viable for certain locations in the county. Those responses exceeding 40%, including the farm stand, ag product preparation and processing, and composting, it's good to know what people are interested in so that we can make sure that enough attention is put towards it and trying to facilitate as much as possible under the new ordinance. For those rural recreation uses, most of these were very popular. The educational opportunities, small-scale events, and similarly related farm-to-table dinners were very popular. The least popular one to this survey was fishing. Doesn't mean that nobody was interested in it, but again, it's good to know where the focus is going into creating this ordinance. The highest concerns with this potential new ordinance were those associated with traffic, noise, signs or lighting, and water availability. This chart goes through a whole range of potential concerns, going towards the lower end of access for bicycles and pedestrians or food safety. Some interesting responses that were received. At this point, we'd like to open up the meeting for discussion. Similar to the survey, we want to hear from you what you think about the range of proposed uses on agricultural lands, the size, scale, intensity of the uses to be allowed, and what permits should be required along with the associated types of development standards. Like we stated earlier in the presentation, please use the chat feature for engaging with the questions that are asked, and or the raise hand feature. Note that comments will be entered onto a whiteboard, which will serve as a record of the public discussion and comments, and that the chat history will be saved for future reference as well. At this time, I will toss it back over to the county. Julie, would you like to introduce the topic?
Thank you, Matt. So our first question is pretty much the same as a question in the survey, but we wanted to hear from people and hear what kind of conversations that they're having. But that is, what are the proposed agriculture enterprise uses that you're most interested in and why? Here's the list of uses again. This is the same list that was on slide 9. And we're interested in knowing, what you're interested in, what uses you're interested in, and why you're interested. Is it that you want to do the use on your farm or ranch? Are you concerned that some of the proposed uses may not be compatible with farming or ranching? And also think about, while most of these uses are already approved for Gaviota with an exempt option, think about what an exemption means, and especially for the new uses, and whether a permit should be required for some uses and not others, or for greater intensities of use. So Wood is going to facilitate this conversation and switch over to a digital whiteboard, but if you can start putting your thoughts in the chat, and perhaps raising your hands as well. If people have got questions, I'll let Wood handle this part.
I have a question. I don't know if you could hear me.
One moment. So we have a question in chat asking, of all the uses, 2 are not available for an exempt status. Can you explain your reasoning behind this? I'd like to stress that this phase of this ordinance is trying to solicit input and into the potential range of uses, no level of permit requirements or development standards have been established at this time.
Matt, I think I can partly answer his question. So
Go for it.
So there was the question about why were the campground, the small scale campground and the lumber processing, why were they not exempt? I don't know about the lumber processing question for sure. I don't know, David might be able to help with that one, but the campground, part of the reason with the permit is it's a use that is not directly related to the agricultural uses of the property. It's a supplemental recreational use, but it also has, I think the small scale campground is limited to 10 campsites, but you also have to provide water service to the campground and some kind of wastewater disposal to the campground. And those things typically are going to require that extra look to make sure that there aren't any land use issues with the location of the campground and with the issues for providing, water service and wastewater disposal. And they also would have to get looked at by environmental health. So I think that's why we have a permit requirement there, and it's the low-level land use permit. I don't know if David knows about the lumber processing, but.
Yeah, I would just add to that as far as the lumber processing, I think there were similar concerns that the board set the permit level at the land use permit rather than the exemption, just because of the nature of the lumber operation. It really was looking at that level for trees that were actually on the property. And so just because of the need to look at potential impacts, they selected the land use permit that was most appropriate for that use.
Thank you, Julie and David. And I think for now, we, as stated near the beginning, we are going to open it up for more of a Q&A question session. However, in the meantime, the question presented at this point is, which uses are you most interested in and why? So if there are any ideas or uses or thoughts related to this, we'll grab them from the chat and post them here up on the discussion board. It's viewable by everyone. For instance, composting is one use selected for the chat, and the use is a popular one in a variety of jurisdictions. In fact, Julie, for the Gaviota Coast Plan area and composting initiatives, do you know how successful it has been out there, or what has gone into this topic?
So I don't have an answer to that question off the top of my head, but that is something that I'll take a note of, and we can find out about that.
Thank you. For educational experiences, one thing that has been brought up in the past is trying to engage either field trips in those agricultural lands or research opportunities for students at our local colleges and universities, establishing partnerships between the educational center and land owners will be important and a consideration during the ordinance. Vermicast solutions was brought up. And I am personally not very familiar with that. For small scale events, going into this ordinance, the scale of these small scale events is up for debate, if you will. And part of this public outreach process is to try and establish what is considered small scale. It will be a question coming up. And it may actually be a good opportunity to move on to question number 2.
Matt,
Can you hear me? I'm calling
David,
in from remotely.
go ahead with the phone.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So just on that last point you made about the size of, my name is Zach Russell from La Patera Ranch, and I think it's going to be dependent on the property about what's appropriate for an event. And first of all, I just think this is a great initiative, and I applaud the county for looking at this and looking at these alternative initiatives or uses for Ag 2 properties. But I think it's probably going to be dependent on the property. There might not be I know you guys often have to make one size, like you have to make the rules, but there might be properties where it's very, the venue in which they're going to be hosting something is very remote, and the opportunity for noise pollution is very low. And then there's going to be properties where there's going to be right up against a residential area. So I think it might be case by case, could be, for looking at what's appropriate for different properties. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much.
So Matt, this is David Lackey. So I was just going to notice in the chat a comment that wasn't posted yet that I was going to answer. So Mr. Howland had posed the question, will this proposed ordinance have any impact on requirements for enrollment under the Williamson Act? And so Julie kind of alluded to many of the Ag 2 lands are currently enrolled in the Ag Preserve program. And the county for those lands have adopted what's called the uniform rules, and it lists out the requirements for both getting into the program and maintaining eligibility. And so with this set of uses and that could occur on Ag Preserve contracted land, those uses will be looked at and whether or not they would be compatible with on-contracted land. And there are some uses that are allowed in our zoning ordinance that are not allowed on contracted land, or they may be allowed but at a reduced level. So it will all depend upon the use and how it relates to the principal agricultural use of the property and the intent of the Ag Preserve program. But so it will be reviewed and considered, and potentially, many of these uses, I assume, will be identified as that they are compatible. But there could be a use or two that there may be certain parameters that are recommended for that use on contracted land that may be more restrictive. So that is still to be evaluated, and it's one of the things that eventually all of this, both the ordinance and any amendments to the uniform rules, they'll move forward ultimately to the Board of Supervisors for their consideration.
Thank you, David. Another question that was posed in chat was, how will any requisite CEQA analysis be done for these exempt accessory uses? Also, if processed via an LUP, which are ministerial permits and statutorily exempt from CEQA, the same question would apply. To get to that, this proposed ordinance will be going through the CEQA review process prior to being adopted. In addition, the development standards themselves are intended to mitigate for any potential environmental impacts. Those specific development standards have not yet been finalized or adopted, and so at this time we are again just trying to gauge what the level of interest is in each of these uses and some initial feedback from the public. And if Julie or David want to add anything to that, you are welcome. All right. For those that have raised their hand, Sam Howland. Sam Howland.
Sorry, I'm sorry. There was a muting problem. Can you hear me now?
No worries. We've got you.
This is the Howland family. Yeah, I appreciated the answer to our question about Williamson Act, but I think the answer was from a slightly different perspective. As I heard the answer, it was about whether these new activities might get one kicked out of the Williamson Act if one is already in. We have some acreage on which cattle graze, but we were not able to enroll it in the Williamson Act because of no isolated water source of our own. The cattle grazer provides his own water. But I was wondering whether some new activity, perhaps under this new ordinance, would allow us to reapply for enrollment in the Williamson Act.
So, Mr. Howland, this is David Lackey. I can answer that question. So, it sounds like they're sort of two different issues. Obviously, to qualify for the contract, one of the requirements is looking at what the agriculture uses of the property, and there's certain requirements for that. And those need to be met to be able to be enrolled and maintain your contract eligibility, and that will continue to be, the review requirement for eligibility for lands so that would need to be resolved irregardless to maintain the contract. But for this new set of uses, what the committee will be looking at is really the first, high-level bar is, are these uses compatible with the principal agricultural use of the property? And so that's the main focus of their review with relationship to this project.
But these new uses, such as like trail rides or school meetings or scientific research, these new usages would not provide an alternative mechanism for qualifying land for the Williamson Act?
No, they would not.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Another individual who has raised their hand is Nancy Emerson. If you would like to unmute, you may contribute.
Nancy Emerson, We Watch. We've been very interested in all of the things that are listed. It seems to me that the list on the left-hand side of the screen, which was things like forestry and things that are more usually thought of as ag activities, would not be a problem to be exempt or have a very low level ministerial permit. But I think the challenge is with the ones that we're calling recreational activities, where you're beginning to bring people onto agricultural land where the neighbors are not necessarily used to that. And so the question of transparency, it seems to me, is very important. And also the degree of saturation of a neighborhood is a very important thing. It almost seems like what you'd like to do is to have pilot projects where you could see how well that particular idea worked, what the problems were, and you then could fine-tune the ordinance based on that experience. So those are some of my concerns, even though we're very interested in the activities. We realize there may be neighborhood pushback.
Understood. Thank you, Nancy. For those questions in the chat, one of them is, may I ask why the name of the ordinance was changed? And I think that Julie may be a good person to answer that question.
So we changed the name of the ordinance at the request of the Board of Supervisors. They wanted us to change the name and come up with something different. So we're trying something different.
And a portion of the question was, is there still thought of there being a tiered system in any way?
Yes. The way that these permits would work would be the same as under the old name, the agricultural tiered permitting. We'd still use tiered permitting. We'd be looking for options that could be exempt, options that could be allowed with a low level permit, and then still likely allowing anything that doesn't meet those low options could then ask for a larger scale use or one that doesn't comply with the development standards through a more complex permit process.
Thank you, Julie. For our second question, we would like to present to the public. Would you like to give an overview here?
Sure.
Thank you.
So I am unmuted. Okay. Yeah. So our second question has to do with small scale. How would you describe small scale? Think about an example, such as a farm-to-table dinner or a small special event. How many people attending would make it a small scale? How frequent the dinners or small events, how frequent would that need to be in order to still be small scale? For example, once a month, only 6 times a year. That's the examples that we're thinking about. And at what point or with what development standards would a small scale dinner or other small type of event require a permit? One of the things that we're thinking of and kind of the questions we're asking ourselves is think about what an exempt use really means. And typically something that's exempt and doesn't require a permit means there really aren't going to be any major land use issues associated with that use, or any issues that couldn't be addressed if you have a few clear required development standards. So, kind of the simplest exempt use to think about as an idea, just to understand the concept, is like a fence. Most people, like everywhere in the county, you can put up a 6-foot fence within your right-of-way on your property line, and that fence, protects your property and can protect your privacy as well. And that 6-foot fence doesn't require a permit. But if you're in that right-of-way or on the property line and you want to put up a 12-foot fence, well, then you got to get a permit for that. So that's what I mean by thinking about some clear development standards for when something's exempt and when it needs a permit. So that's the kind of things we ask ourselves. And what we want to hear from you is, what do you think small scale? What does it mean to you?
We haven't had a chance to go through every single one of the survey responses regarding the total number of people. However, they have ranged wildly with a number of perspectives as to what is small, especially even in today's COVID era. The small event is 2 people sometimes, but looking forward and into the future as a long-range plan, what would be requiring either heightened review or a conditional use permit, those would not necessarily apply under a small-scale use. We have a comment in the chat that mentions for small-scale camping, 5 sites or less. We have a chat indicating 50 people probably means 25 cars or so, and that 50 people or less would be small scale. Another person in the chat has indicated small scale camping of being 10 or less. Apparently I was on the wrong slide for facilitating this discussion. Thank you so much, Gina. Depends on the property. I see that would be yeah, it would depend on the property. Ag 2 parcels by definition are large and can certainly park 25 cars easily, and that 50 people would be fine, is what one of the chat comments has to say. Two times per month is another frequency that's offered for 50 people or less for farm-to-table dinners. For small scale, there's also an element of size on the parcel. So it's not just the number of people that would be coming, but how much room would these take up? Is that even something that should be considered by the ordinance? Camping pretty consistently seems to be 5 or 10 or less. There's agreement with 2 times per month. We have one individual who has raised their hand, Nancy. I am going to, you can unmute if you would like to contribute.
Well, to me, to have you review what the winery ordinance allows, because I think it probably should be smaller than what the winery ordinance allows.
Okay. Thank you.
And so this is David Lackey, and I have kind of throw out a question, and maybe some of the attendees have either participated in farm-to-table dinners or a little bit more familiar in terms of that specific use, in terms of like number of attendees, what feels or what has your experience been in terms of what's a good fit in terms of the number of attendees that would fall into that small scale category. So if you have any thoughts on that, we would appreciate it.
There's a comment on scale about campsite locations, and that within campsite locations within parcels needs to be considered. It should be internal to the property, and that near property lines is a 24/7 impact to neighbors for extended periods of time. The number of sites should be linked to the farm size. Less than 5 is what they feel. Farm to table dinner, breaking even at 20 people, worth it at 25 to 30, and making money at 40. That brings up a good question that we have also wondered about internally. For this enterprise ordinance to be successful, it needs to be monetarily beneficial to the property owner. So for those that have either worked with farm-to-table dinners or attended farm-to-table dinners or have operated them, knowing what the minimum number of people it takes to make money is very useful. So thank you for bringing up that information, and is certainly something to consider when it comes to the size of what is considered small scale. Okay. Thank you for your guys' engagement. Julie, would you like to move on to the next slide?
I would, but I do want to, I think there were a couple of questions in there in the chat that I wanted to address. I think somebody asked if I knew how much of the ag land was in the North County, and I don't actually have those statistics available, so that's something that we'll have to come back with at a later time. Another person asked what, in response to, I think, to Ms. Emerson's comment that we should look to the Winery Ordinance for small scale events, and it should be smaller than the Winery Ordinance. I would have to look that up in the code, but it's basically it's tiered, with the smallest wineries that don't have tasting rooms not even allowed to have special events, and then I believe there's some tiered level that's like they're either 6 per year or 12 per year, and I don't recall the number of attendees, but they're probably, I think they're larger than 50 people. So, they're looking at, larger events like weddings and things rather than smaller events. So
Julie, I have the zoning ordinance open. I can respond to that. So for the winery ordinance, for wineries that are permitted with a land use permit, it allows up to 4 events per year, and then the attendance at each event is limited to 150 people or less. The next tier above that is if a development plan is required, and that would allow up to 8 events per year in the same level of 150 attendees maximum.
Okay.
So I noticed a couple of other interesting comments in the chat before we move on about campgrounds. I know some people were talking about dry campgrounds should be exempt. There is still the question of wastewater disposal, but we'll take that comment into consideration, because that could always be the wastewater disposal could always be a particular concern. And let's see, someone else also said for campsites there should be no open fires allowed because of the risk of fire.
And Julie, I'll just take the opportunity to chime in as some upcoming features for our next workshop, since many of these uses, as Julie has mentioned, are bringing people on the property, need to address both water and wastewater, but also the food service components of that. So we are planning to have a representative from Environmental Health Services to hopefully educate all of us and provide some information on what current requirements are for different uses and some considerations for landowners in terms of permit review and other siting considerations for many of these uses. So look forward to that, getting more information for all of us and opportunity for you to ask questions. That'll certainly be on our agenda for workshop number 2.
All right. For the uses and the size, there was one other topic that was brought up by Nancy asking how many activities should be allowed on any one farm or ranch at the same time. So which activities might lend themselves to being combined. In terms of the relationship between these proposed uses, I think they're getting at, will you be able to do all 12 of these or all 15 of these on one parcel at the same time? And will that be considered? And it will be considered. At this time, again, I think we're just trying to gauge the interest in each of these. But that is a good point. And if there's any of these uses that you'd like to bring up specifically, some combo that you're concerned about, that is useful to know. And we'll go back to that main slide that had all the uses on it in a few. But thank you for your input at this time. Going to move on to the next slide and discussion question to spark the next round of input. And that is this slide here. Julie, would you like to introduce it?
So I know, thanks, Matt. I know some of you have already started putting some comments in the chat about this topic, but what are some concerns that you have about any of the uses? These are a few uses that staff has been able to think of. Do you have concerns like these, or can you think of other potential nuisance or land use compatibility issues that we haven't thought of that we should consider? And when you think about these, again, it all ties into what would make these recreational uses incidental to the primary agricultural use of the property.
Thank you, Julie. And just for a moment, I'm going to go back to the earlier slide that showed all the uses, just so that people can take a look and contribute any other ideas or concepts that may jog their memory. So here's that range of uses, those that are supplementary ag uses and those that are more rural recreation uses. There is that comment brought up about one of them. Well, it's understood that the supplementary ag uses are much more associated with agricultural production for food production or similar uses, whereas those rural recreation uses are bringing people out into those rural areas of the Ag 2 lands of the county. It's come up a few times in chat, the fire and ignition sources. And one comment earlier that open fires at campgrounds should be, I'll find the exact language, but I think it was prohibit for campsites, there should be no open fires allowed. The fire risk is just too high. With a response of propane heaters and propane fire tables are safe. So, fire. Disturbing the neighbors. And Julie, the EDRNs in the county, are those primarily Ag 1 or Ag 2?
Most EDRNs are Ag 1.
Okay.
I don't recall off the top of my head any that include Ag 2.
Yeah, they're all Ag 1. I mean, they're not.
Okay.
I'll rephrase that. The only agricultural zone that's appropriate within an EDRN is Ag 1. Ag 2 is outside of those areas in the rural area.
Thank you for that clarification. I was just thinking in my mind about the proximity of homes together. I know there are still some Ag 2 lands where the the neighborhood and the residences are somewhat close together. What is an EDRN? An EDRN
Yes.
is a
Someone just saw that someone asked that. An EDRN is called, it stands for Existing Developed Rural Neighborhood. And usually what they are is there's some kind of rural subdivision for 1 acre home. Sometimes the lots are bigger, sometimes they're 1 acre, sometimes they're smaller, but they developed long time ago, like decades ago, before the current zoning and land use categories were set up for the county. And so they're little contained areas where you can't expand those subdivisions further into the agricultural lands that typically surround them.
Thank you, Julie.
And Gunnar gave an example of Arroyo Quemada, which is one that is on the Gaviota coast. Trying to think, David, do you know of any names offhand that you could mention, like in the San Ynez Valley, as examples?
Tepiscay in North
Yeah,
County.
like Bobcat Springs up by north of Yuleton is one. Yeah, Tepiscay is probably the largest EDRN, and that's north of the San Ynez River, and it has pretty large parcel sizes, but collectively it's a mix. So you do see a range of smaller parcels, but some, that may be 20 acres in size or more. Yeah, Julie, the main reason, as Julie stated, was to essentially recognize those parcels, and the EDRN is a boundary around those areas, that they're sort of an anomaly in parcel sizes that's smaller than the larger surrounding rural agricultural lands. Ag 2 lands.
Thank you both and somewhat coming back to this discussion, as those EDRNs are in an Ag 1 area, this ordinance is not proposed to apply to those smaller Ag 1 parcels, and will be applying to the Ag 2 parcels, the more rural areas. So on this discussion question about concerns for the proposed uses, the lighting, particularly at night, was brought up for those rural areas that are more removed from development and street lights and all that.
I've also noticed a comment about combining activities, for example, camping and some kind of food service or educational workshops in some kind of farm to table. So it sounds like in that case, it's not so much a concern about the proposed use, but there might be some appropriate uses that would pair well together.
Yes. And also another comment that's been brought up that has to do with trespassing issues with camping or other activities, which it seems to be more so related with the rural recreational uses and potential trespassing that could occur with those. One suggestion for the going back to the fire concern was let the fire department determine what days we can have open campfires. And yes, on Pairing Well, hosting a 5-day workshop, people camp and we feed them.
So Julie, one of the other earlier comments, I think from Nancy Emerson, maybe you can respond to, I think she asked with respect to ministerial permits, is there noticing of neighbors typically on ministerial level permits?
So we have basically 2 ministerial or quasi-ministerial permits. The very lowest level permit is a zoning clearance, and that is a permit that you have to get from the county, and that kind of permit does not have any noticing of the neighbors, and it is also not a permit that can be appealed to the Planning Commission. The next permit up is a land use permit, and the land use permit is notified to the neighbors. It's notified when the permit application is filed, and then once that permit is approved, it could be appealed by the neighbors, or if the permit's denied, the property owner could also appeal a denial of the permit. So there's those 2 low-level permits. The exemption, because you're exempt from a permit, you don't actually have to come in and get anything from the county. You have to comply with any standards. So if there's a setback, you would have to comply with the setback, but you don't have to come into the county. You can come into the county and have a plan stamped exempt, and there is a fee that is associated with that. But exemptions also, because they're not permits at all, are not noticed to neighbors.
I don't see additional comments that have come up associated with concerns. Are there any other thoughts or topics that would like to be brought up associated with this question, or shall we move to the next one?
Well, let's move on to the next.
Sounds good. Our next question, which is
This one.
To last is
Sorry, everyone. I had to mute myself. There's a siren going by outside. It was quite loud. I hope that you didn't have to listen to it too. So our next question is, what is incidental food service? So I looked up incidental in the dictionary just as a thought, because there could be a lot of different things about what is incidental food service, but incidental means of a minor, casual, or subordinate nature. So thinking about incidental food service, should it be provided only to those who are visiting the farm or the ranch for another activity? What does it mean? Is it the selling of prepackaged food, like at a farm stand or a U-Pick operation? Is the prepackaged food prepared on site, on the farm, or is it from off-site? Could it include preparing fresh food on the site and selling it at the farm? Or would it be like having a food truck come visit the farm at certain times? So these are some of our thoughts. We'd like to know what you think.
Thank you, Julie. the incidental food service, we have a comment in chat mentioning outdoor barbecues, pizza ovens, food trucks available to anyone, such as visiting the farm stand. For the food truck, that is a interesting contribution. I know, well, I haven't been involved in discussions where that's come up for us. I think it's mostly been talked about as a concessions type use. Is there anybody that would like to speak on this topic? If you went for a rural recreation opportunity in our beautiful Santa Barbara ag land, would you like to experience some incidental food along the way? Yeah. Not all farmers and ranchers may want to provide food themselves. Need to look at the possibility of food being brought in, as not all participants in an activity may want to bring their own food. Food trucks are permitted and could be used in conjunction with an event. You need to provide options. And going back to our slides here. There we are. The outdoor barbecue, the pizza oven, want to allow food to be brought in. Understood on the comment to consider the intelligence of the landowner, farmer, rancher, or steward. Thank you for your contribution. For Julie or David, are there any additional thoughts on this topic that you would like to bring up or questions you'd like to pose?
This is Julie here. One of the reasons why the incidental food question is something that we really have to think about is anytime there is food service involved, there's the question about where is the food prepared? Is it prepared in a commercial kitchen or a kitchen that has permits from the public health department? And so that comes from state law. And so, that's why we want to hear your ideas about what is incidental food if we put that on a site, because where's the food prepared? Where is it coming from? A food truck, if you just invite them to your farm when you're having some kind of, small farm event or on certain occasions, a food truck is permitted and separately. And so the fact that somebody's running a food truck and has a license to do that, they better have their permits already in line. You're just kind of hiring them to come to your property. And that's done elsewhere. And you, the farmer or the rancher, doesn't have to think about preparing food and whether you've got a facility that has to get that kind of permit from the health department. So that's why we're asking these questions. What does it mean to you? What would it be on a farm property, and how would it be incidental to your agricultural operation?
Yeah, and I think just to add on to what Julie said, this is David Lackey. That's all of these are good things to start thinking about, and I think we'll have a really great opportunity to explore those questions more in depth at our second workshop. When we have Environmental Health Service representative here. And also part of that in terms of, well, it's now probably 5+ years, but I mean, there's also other recent changes in state law that allowed additional non-hazardous food to be provided at farm stands. And so Some of those changes were incorporated into Gaviota Ordinance, but we're also going to be looking at, those type of expanded allowed food options that can be provided at a farm stand. And as Gunnar, I see Gunnar is in the room as well. He recalls one of the things for farm stands that we allowed for Gaviota that we're also going to be looking at adding countywide to farm stands is, what are some other things that you could potentially sell in a portion of the square footage for the farm stand? And so they were additional, and I'm going to lose the term here, artisanal crafts was a category. And so they could be some other related non-food things that you could be providing for sale. There you go. I knew Gunnar would have it. So the food topic touches a lot of different things, not only some recent changes that landowners may not be aware that are currently allowed by state law, but then also these concepts of incidental food service, the farm to table dinners, and then the next topic that Julie's going to be talking about is cooking classes. They all have good questions surrounding them, and we'll continue to explore and certainly get into it in more depth at our next meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, David.
Okay, Matt, I think we can go on to the next slide, cooking classes, which is going to be our last specific topic for discussion. So this is, again, one of the, I think we had 5 here. One of the specific uses that the Board of Supervisors asked us to add to the ordinance is to allow cooking classes. So what are they? Are they demonstration, hands-on preparation? Do attendees get to eat what is prepared? Should they only be held at wineries because those they typically have facilities already, kitchens at their tasting rooms? So give us your ideas. Please put them in the chat, and we'll share them with everyone.
For the cooking classes, one hurdle that's yet to be looked at is the kitchens involved and what sort of clearance may or may not be required to use that for the public. So getting an idea of what the public sees as a cooking, it seems like a simple question or answer, but just trying to gauge if you're wanting to do big barbecue style things, or if you're trying to do more along the salad and fruit and vegetable angle, or all of the above, or whatever your input happens to be.
And often some of these, cooking classes, demonstrations, we've probably all seen, on TV shows. Often they're, outdoors. They've got, a hot plate or just whatever they need to prepare, or if it's something simple, but it's, sort of demonstration. The participants, get to enjoy the meals prepared. And so often it's a local chef or something that may be giving the demonstration. So I think all of, from sort of a low key, or the barbecue example, outdoors, another example where you may not need a kitchen facility to prepare it, but then also to the more formal, if the kitchen is already on the premises, that certainly would be a great venue for that use. And so we're looking at sort of the full spectrum of those activities.
For the cooking classes, we have a lot of agreement going on in the chat. that attendees should eat what is prepared, that uses should not be limited to wineries. That comes up 3 or 4 times. It should be hands-on and not a demonstration only. That it's a good way to learn new skills. This gives a good foundation for us to start with for coming up with the direction we need to take and what sort of either hopefully not hurdles to jump, but just what needs to be considered for it to occur on county land from a business enterprise perspective. Okay. Is one of the problems of public health issues? I don't know the answer to that question right now, but I know that it's a consideration.
So I see that comment as well. I think that is what the potential issue is, and that is something that we're going to have to research more to find out.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
This was our final direct question for the group. Moving on from here, just for general awareness, we are currently doing this first public workshop and survey. The survey is closing on the 31st, the last day of the month. Next month, we'll be going to the Ag Advisory Committee to receive their input on some of these initial concepts and ideas. Tentatively planning for May for our second workshop. Hopefully by that time we'll have some, well, it's intended by that time to have some more solid footing on what is being proposed. More of the technical aspects that were brought up earlier in this discussion. In summer, we launched the EIR and NOP. By fall, we should have a public draft EIR and the associated environmental hearings. And it's intended that by winter, we have a final EIR, some new uses proposed, and the decision maker hearings. To stay engaged on the project, there is the project website itself. It's just countyofsb.org/agenterprise. All of the workshop notifications and survey links and recent information will be posted to that website. You can also check out the semi-related farm stays, ordinance, and recreation master plan projects. Those are going on their own timelines, but they have some exciting workshops and public engagement opportunities over the next 2 months. And finally, thank you for attending. If you use your QR reader on your phone, you can take the survey by scanning that QR code. And I'm sure Julie will also have some words on this, but we are going to have some Q&A, more open mic interaction following their input. Julie or David, would you like to take it?
So I'm just taking a look at some of the comments that are coming into the chat. We have one comment stating that if we want to keep the county rural, we need to allow landowners the opportunity to create other income on their property. And we have somebody also saying that we need landowners, ranchers, and farmers to be aligned. According to the USDA, we've lost 11% of our small farms in Santa Barbara County in the last 5 years and 20% since 1997. Without farms, there are no Ag 2 lands. So I think these are some good comments. Keep the ball rolling. Let's get this done before he's old and totally gray. That's what we're trying to do. That's why we're trying to keep with the small scale uses at this point.
Well, I'm glad Gunnar said totally, because I was going to question if he had no gray hair. He's ever youthful every time I see him.
And we have a word to the wise by another attendee who is a former agriculturalist whose family lost their land because they could not diversify income streams. So that is a warning that we should all heed in allowing our farmers to have various opportunities to supplement their farm income. Do we have any other questions or comments?
It's encouraging to see so much support.
So I do want to say that we're going to look into the questions that we couldn't answer tonight, and we'll try to have answers when we come back for our second workshop. And we'll also try to get some more information about questions surrounding water supply and wastewater disposal, and public health questions with the surrounding the questions about food service, whether it's, you know, the dinners or incidental food service or cooking classes.
Thank you to all those who contributed. The slides with the notes that were made today are going to be made available as well between now and the next workshop. As Julie was saying, we will be having another workshop where hopefully we'll have some more answers and a more solid ordinance to propose. I'm excited about this. I can see the people here are as well, and hoping as we go through this there will be even more engagement over the next, as in more participation from the ag community moving forward. It's helpful to know what the tone is as we progress forward on these projects.
Okay, everyone. Well, I think we should wrap it up at this time. We haven't been getting any more comments, so thank you all for attending tonight. We appreciate hearing from you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next workshop. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.